So on today's episode, we are joined by the wonderful Avery Davis Lamb, who is one of two new co-executive directors of Justice Ministries, which is the organization that represents and advocates for the creation, care, and environmental justice policies of 38 major Christian denominations and Orthodox communions, as those communions and denominations work to protect and restore God's creation. And we're going to talk about being ready for the storm. And I'm not just talking about traditional disaster response, but more importantly, to prepare for and to adapt to, and really to serve our communities who face more frequent and intense weather due to climate change, and significant increases in longer term climate impacts like drought and sea level rise. And I mean, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, it's really clear we're seeing unprecedented extreme weather, record shattering heat waves, deadly flooding, intense wildfires, both here and of course all around the world. Germany and China in particular, want to hold them up in prayer. And faith communities can play a critical role in responding, but also in preparing for these impacts and helping communities build resilience. We need to protect our homes, our livelihoods, and each other. So please welcome me in join me in welcoming, Avery Davis Lamb to help us understand these impacts and the opportunities for faith communities right now. He's really leading some of this work nationally, and I'm so glad he's here. So welcome, Avery. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Annie. It's good to be here. Thanks for the intro.
Of course. And I just want to say congratulations on your new role. Really thanks for all of the ongoing work that Justice Ministries has been doing. You've been leading this work for some time now, and now stepping into this leadership role. I'm so excited to see all of the great things that you're going to be doing and ways that Blessed Tomorrow can support you in it. So
thank you. Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah. Well, before we hop into, I'm going to be turning the presentation over to Avery here in just a moment to share some of the exciting and interesting information that they have put together. But I'm curious, and I ask a lot of our guests, there has to be a story behind your own personal passion and commitment to this work. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about what drives you to care for creation, and I think particularly why you've been so inspired to get involved in this resilience work in particular.
Yeah, well, I'll share that in the words of Pope Francis, I had my own ecological conversion a few years ago, about a decade ago. So, having been brought up in the church and not hearing a lot about climate change or the environmental crisis, there was just a moment in my life where I felt God's voice calling me to care for God's creation and lead my fellow Christians in doing the same. And so since then, I've really dug into the work of creation care and creation justice. And then just in the last couple of years, seeing climate disasters unfold around us, as you've already shared, Annie, seeing how churches are not immune to climate disasters, the flooding that is happening on our coastal churches, the devastation to churches that are being affected by wildfires and by mudslides. Everyone's affected, our communities included, and our communities have the physical, the social, and the spiritual assets to be hubs of resilience, to really live out their Christian mission by being hubs of climate resilience.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for sharing. And I hope it always inspires me. I hope it inspires other folks listening. Well, I'm happy to turn the floor over to you. I know you're going to share a slide presentation and some really interesting information and data and resources with our team, with our group here today. So
great.
Turn it over.
All right, thanks so much, Annie. Okay. You see that all right? As a yes.
Great.
Great, thanks. So thanks for the intro, Annie. Again, my name is Avery Lamb. I'm the co-executive director of Creation Justice Ministries. And here's my email. Please, if there's anything in this presentation that piques your interest or that you have questions about or that you want to follow up on, please reach out to me by email. I'll skip over this because Annie already introduced us, but you can find more about Creation Ministries at creationjustice.org. Again, we equip, mobilize, and educate Christian communions and denominations 38 in total, so that we can protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Last May, I launched the Climate Resilience at Justice Ministries, and I launched it for the reasons that I was talking about earlier, that our churches are not immune to the impacts of climate change that are already being felt, and that every year we can tell are more and more severe. And our churches have the assets, the resources to support their communities, to be beacons of light in a world that is overcome by the darkness of climate change and climate grief. And when I talk about these assets, I don't just mean the physical assets of buildings and land. I also mean the spiritual assets, the spiritual tools, rituals, traditions that we need to make sense of the changes that are happening all around us, and to build community and power and resilience in our new climate change world. So this is the central question of our climate resilience project, just how can this be hubs of climate resilience in their community, helping their neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis. And it's really important how we define resilience here. I think there can be a sense, colloquially, that resilience is a passive stance. And I think that's something that we really want to avoid here. So for us, the resilience has a three-part definition. And this definition comes from a report from the Kresge Foundation called Pathways to Resilience in 2015. Pathways to Resilience defines it as mitigation, adaptation, and democracy all working together in tandem. So rather than bouncing back from a disaster, it's using this crisis as an opportunity to bounce forward toward a more just and equitable society. And an important piece of this is that resilience is not one thing. Rather, resilience is multiple factors working together in tandem. And we'll be sure to parse out some of those factors later on in the presentation. Now, I just want to ground us a little bit in the moment. And, you know, I think most of us on the call are aware of the climate disasters around us. But, you know, part of our role is to bear witness to what is happening around us. So I just want to bear witness to what we're seeing in the world right now. What we're seeing is simultaneous climate disasters unfolding not only in the US, but all around the world. And it's not just, you know, it's not just frontline communities. It's not just coastal communities who are experiencing the impacts. Yes, those communities are getting hardest hit because of the systems and principalities in our world. But we're really seeing everyone feeling the effects of climate change. So here we have an image of the terrible flooding in Germany from 2 weeks ago, which we know was intensified from climate change. Here we have an image of the drought in California, which has, you know, caused the intensification of the wildfire season there. And for anyone on the East Coast, you are directly experiencing the impacts of the climate crisis on the West Coast because our air quality is elevated. Here in Durham, North Carolina, our air quality is almost, or the particulate count is almost twice what it typically is. And that's because we're getting the smoke from the wildfires that are in the West. So this is important because resilience, as we defined it in the previous slide, is proactive. We don't just want to be responding to these disasters because really there's only so much that we can do in response. What we want to do is we want to be prepared with these disasters, to take action to limit the severity, and to love and care for the communities who are being impacted by them. These large-scale disasters, yes. And we also have the slower everyday impacts, like, for example, sunny day flooding. Here's a picture of Annapolis, Maryland on the left and Miami, Florida on the right. This is the slow violence of climate change, to use the language from Rob Nixon. It's the climate change that, affects us a little bit more every single day until we get to a situation like we have in Annapolis and in Miami. And these are only a few of the impacts of climate change. There's so many other impacts that are happening. And so what I want to share with you is a framework of faithful resilience. So how can churches build resilience in the face of what can feel like totally overwhelming climate impacts all around us? What can we do when we face the climate emergency, the climate crisis? What can we do in our local community? Well, what I want to share with you are 6 ways around which churches can serve as hubs of climate resilience. And those 6 are land, advocacy, community, migration, building, and worship. And these themes are all compiled in the Faithful Resilience Guide, which Creation Justice Ministries launched here. And this guide helps lead your church in deepening its resilient witness. We'll be sure to drop the link to the Faithful Resilience Guide in the chat. So I'll go through all of these briefly. The first one is land. So how can we change the way we treat our land to care for our neighbors and build resilience? I've included a couple of examples here of how churches have engaged in this. St. Luke's, Eastport, and Annapolis rehabilitated a wetland on their property that serves as a sponge to hold some of that water that is impacting downtown Annapolis, like we saw in the previous photo, that, when downtown is flooding, their property here is absorbing that extra water. And it's a form of solidarity with their community, that they're using their little piece of land to build climate resilience. Another, of course, is advocacy. So engaging in networks of environmental and climate justice in your community, because again, resilience is climate adaptation and mitigation and deep democracy. The latter two are intimately related to advocacy. And of course, we know that right now as we see the battles around who can participate in our democracy. And what I want to share is that resilience is directly related to voting rights, because a resilient system is one which includes the voices of all the people who are being affected. The third is, how can we prepare to support our local community in climate disasters? So, I mentioned earlier spiritual resilience, and I think the church particularly has a role to play in building spiritual resilience, because the climate crisis and climate disasters are traumatic experiences for communities. And we need to name the grief that comes with the loss and the changes that we're seeing from climate change, and the trauma that can be a result of climate disasters. And frequently, the church is the only place where community members have a space to talk about grief, to work through trauma. And so it's important for our churches to build spaces for digesting climate grief, for working through climate trauma, for pastors to think through how particularly climate grief and trauma are different from some of the other kinds of pastoral care problems that we've been trained to do. The fourth one here is climate migration. So the question of how can we welcome our local and global neighbors who are displaced from the climate crisis? And I think an important piece here is that this, climate resilience is not just an issue for congregations who are on the front lines of climate disasters. It's not just an issue for those who are, bordering wildfires in the West, or who are on the coast in the Southeast or in the Gulf South. But really other congregations who are not as directly impacted need to be in solidarity with the congregations who have, and need to know that pretty soon they will be impacted, we will be impacted by patterns of climate migration. So you can see the image here on the right. This shows how inland counties will be impacted by people displaced from sea level rise. And what we see here is that the darker the county is, the more people will settle in that county. So you can see the distribution here. Even though the Midwest is, pretty protected from coastal flooding, and just to share, this is just people displaced from coastal flooding. Although the Midwest and parts of the Southeast, may not be directly affected, we'll be welcoming people who are directly affected. And so what does hospitality look like for our churches as we're bringing in and welcoming people who are displaced by climate change? How can we serve as sanctuaries for climate migrants, for both people who are displaced internally in the United States and people who are coming from other countries? The fifth piece here is building. So how can our buildings be sanctuaries from climate disasters? I think our spaces are really important. How we design our spaces are a reflection of the things we care about, and really more deeply a reflection of our theology. So if we have a theology of hospitality, then our spaces ought to be reflecting that. So how can we build resilient infrastructure? How can we build solar panels with battery storage in order to provide energy resilience in the midst of outages? How can we stock up on cots to set out for, not only our unhoused neighbors in our communities, but if there is a climate impact and a ton of people are displaced, being prepared to house those people in our buildings, which, frequently are empty 5 or 6 days of the week. So this is just an invitation to consider all of the creative ways on how we can use our buildings to build resilience. And then finally, our worship. So how can our Christian worship and teaching encourage the building of the resilient community? What's key here is that the ways we structure our worship life resonate beyond the walls of our sanctuaries. That by incorporating elements of climate education and the worship of God through God's creation, we can start to develop the norms that support God's people and support God's creation in the midst of the climate crisis. That building a climate resilience church is not only an outward-facing activity, but it's also about rendering our hearts, about cultivating the soul sets, the mindsets and the soul sets inside of us that allow us to be more compassionate towards God's creation and towards God's people. One way that we can do this is thinking through new rituals, thinking through ways that we can innovate on our Christian tradition, both deepening our commitment to the tradition and innovating it. And this is not something new for the church. This is a process that has happened throughout Christian history, which is adapting our Christian tradition for the challenges of the moment. And we know that new rituals that are grounded in tradition, they can help us make meaning in the midst of the climate crisis, and they can spur us towards action. So perhaps we need to incorporate new modes of confession, new ways for us to lament together losses that we're seeing. And very importantly, rituals of vision that we can see forward to envision a beloved community, envision a just, equitable, and beautiful society. So I'm going to transition here and talk about, well, just to reflect back. So all of this is sort of long-term thinking, that we don't just want to get stuck in a mode of responding to climate disasters, but how can we think long-term about building resilience in our communities? And that's very much what these 6 themes in the Faithful Resilience Guide are getting at. But I also want to share with you some resources and possibilities for responding to climate disasters in your communities. Because as I said earlier, resilience is not one thing. It's many things working in tandem. And some of those things are long-term changes and changing mindsets and soul sets, as we just talked about. But it's also loving our community right now and building structures and plans to protect our community from the climate disasters that are here. So how do I prepare for climate disasters in the short term? Well, I'm going to share a few possibilities here for you and then point you to further resources for study if this is something that you do want to be thinking about at your congregation. The first thing to do is to assess your risk. So this is a risk assessment worksheet from FEMA, and we can provide the link for that in the chat, and I have it on my slide later on. But essentially, what this does is it walks through, how is your congregation and community at risk from different kinds of climate emergencies? What is the human impact? What is the property impact? What is the operational impact? And what is the probability of this risk happening? And then from that, you get a total risk. So you can go through this worksheet. Think about your own context. Of course, building resilience and responding to climate disasters is extremely local. Not only is every community going to be different, but every congregation is really going to be different because the impacts are going to play out differently depending on the assets of your community. So think through your context, think through the kinds of disasters that you might be most susceptible to. And then again, think through the unique needs in your community that may not be true everywhere else. And then move on to assessing your assets. So you do a risk assessment, and then you do an asset mapping exercise. So here's a couple of examples of how you can assess your assets. On the left here is a participatory mapping exercise. So, break your congregation down into small groups and have each of them on a sheet of poster board map out what the assets of the community are. Where's the church? How is it related to the schools? How is it related to the other institutions in your community that are building out, beautiful, just, sustainable structures? And then another way to do that is on the right, which is to write it out as well. And I find both of these to be helpful in tandem because, of course, people operate in different ways. I also just want to thank Caroline Hamilton Arnold at the Disciples of Christ Week of Compassion for these slides. Later on, I'll provide a link to a workshop we did with her back in May called Preparing Your Congregation for Climate Disasters. And that would be somewhere to, again, dig in more deeply. But these images do come from Reverend Hamilton Arnold. Again, here's another way of assessing assets, which is a facilities inventory. And this is just a good thing to have on hand, to think through what do we have in our facilities? Are we prepared with fire alarms, with extinguishers? Are we prepared with cots? As I said earlier, when people are displaced, with charging stations, cell phone cords, computer chargers for, people who have to leave their houses or are unhoused and need somewhere to go. Can our congregation serve as a cooling facility when there's heat stress? Can it serve as a heating facility, when there are freak climate-driven winter storms like we saw in Texas this last year? And all of those resources that I just shared are available here. So at the top, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has a really good faith preparedness toolkit. Again, Week of Compassion, which is the organization, the Disciples of Christ, Disaster Preparedness and Response Organization. And then this excellent book, if you want to dig in more, which is called Help and Hope, Disaster Preparedness and Response Tools for Congregations. So just to sort of summarize what we've just gone through, here are some action steps. So if you're looking for short-term steps that you can take after you get off this call today. Here are 4 things that you can do, almost immediately. And I encourage you to also plan out these long-term steps, because climate resilience is about building power, building resilience over time. It's not just about responding, it's about preparing. And so we really do need long-term investment in resilient solutions. So again, here are 4 possibilities for long-term resilience. Again, I just want to put in a plug for our Faithful Resilience Guide. This is a perfect way to get your congregation or community talking about climate resilience. It's a 6-part guide that goes through those 6 themes I named earlier. Each theme includes a scripture, a reflection on the scripture, practical resources, a case study to learn from, and questions for either your small group or your congregation. This can be used either as a Bible study with your green team or with a small group. It can also be adapted as a sermon series for the pastor or the leader of your congregation. And I just want to end with this prayer for resilience. So if you'll join me in prayer. Like Job in the whirlwind, or Jonah in the storm at sea, we come before you in awe of your power, God. We recognize that today's storms and whirlwinds are not your judgment on your people, but the distortion of natural systems through our own sin and hubris. As the storms and whirlwinds of the climate crisis accelerate around us, may our sanctuaries be a place of refuge and resilience, where all of God's creation might be protected and sustained, and from which we, people of God, might be sent forth to bring healing and justice. Amen. Again, here's my contact info, and I think we're going to transition now into some conversation.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, and just thank you. I mean, it's if ever there was a time for us to really be investing and thinking about this and the role we as individuals might play, we as clergy or faith leaders might play, or as members of our own community. And I think the work that you're doing in partnership with all of the denominations that you represent and support, in addition to, I know, other organizations as well, is just so important. And Avery shared so many different resources with us just a moment ago, and I do encourage you, please visit creationjustice.org to learn more. And my colleague Jess has been chatting out all of those great resources. We also have at a higher level in the Blessed Tomorrow Moving Forward Guide, sections on things like mitigation, reducing our carbon footprint, but also things like what we call creating refuge, which is the concept that Avery was talking about. How can we become a sanctuary in our community for those experiencing climate impacts? And so there's some great information and some language that you might use to start conversations with others, again, in your own congregation or in your community, as you think about doing this more. Or starting this for the first time. So yeah, we've had a couple of questions come in from the audience that I'd like to just kind of get to right off the bat. And first is more of a housekeeping item from your presentation, which is people were interested in the source for the map that you showed with the counties affected by sea level rise. So is that something that you could share?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have included a citation on the slide. I apologize for that. How about I find the link to that study? It was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
I think my colleague Jess may have found it. So Jess,
that would
if
be
that's
great.
The right one, feel free to chat it out. And then just a reminder to everyone listening, we will be sharing the recording with you all. They're all posted on the Blessed Tomorrow, the ecoAmerica YouTube channel. And I also write a summary blog after each episode, and I list all of the different resources that we've been sharing with you. So I know you might be grabbing some of them or opening them as we go, But also please remember that blog is a great place to go. And Avery, we can share that out there.
Yeah, and it looks like the one that Jess shared is the correct one.
Great.
Yeah, not from PNAS, but from PLOS. So I can drop that in. Oh yeah, great. Thanks, Jess. Looks like Jess got it. Thanks so much.
Thanks to Alex for asking. I'm sure you weren't the only one curious.
Yeah, it's a really important study. So yeah.
Great. And we had another question come in from Reverend Gretchen, who is interested in recommendations that you might have to get her and other faith communities, her own community and other faith communities, to lean into that advocacy side of this work, and how do you help to bring congregations along who might be, of course, overwhelmed with other very pressing issues right now. Maybe they're struggling financially, or they're unsure of the importance or the urgency of climate change and their role. So, can you speak to that a little bit? I know you've been working not only at the national level, but also in the series, talking to individuals and congregations.
Yeah, I'd say for a congregation that is new to advocacy, that might be uncomfortable with advocacy, or that just is working on so many social issues that the climate change is not front and center, that really plugging into local advocacy is important. So I would recommend, just taking note of how is climate change impacting you locally in your community. Is it air quality? Is it heat stress? From if you're living in a city, is it increased, urban heat, which we know cities trap heat? And then plugging into existing advocates who are working on those issues. And I guarantee you that there are folks working on local climate change issues, both from a faith-based perspective and from a non-faith-based perspective. The issue is so big that starting locally can be really helpful, and I think can often feel less partisan for communities who are wary of getting involved in national politics. I will say that if there's any time to stretch and do advocacy on a national level, now is the time, because what we're seeing happen in Congress right now is a once in a generation opportunity to pass climate policy in this very tight 10-year window that we're in right now, where we can make the difference on the future for generations down the road. So the next 6 months are going to be critical from a federal policy perspective. And what we need right now is voices of faith, of community members, congregants, talking about the moral imperative to pass robust climate legislation as part of the infrastructure packages that are moving through Congress. So it might be uncomfortable. It probably is uncomfortable. Honestly, it can be uncomfortable for me to pick up the phone and call my senator or representative. But if there ever was a time, now is that time.
Oh, amen. And I just want to reiterate on that and share a couple of ideas and next steps for you all listening. So please be sure to connect with Creation Justice Ministries. You guys do really fabulous advocacy alerts and opportunities. Whether you're Christian or not, it might be helpful for you to rob and borrow some of the language that you all use. We can all be doing something, but that's something to think about. If you are a person of faith listening to us today, see what your faith tradition is doing on this issue and get involved in some of the advocacy work that they're offering. Many faith traditions have staff who are responsible for doing advocacy, both at the national level and perhaps even at a state level. And so, go to your websites, figure out, how you can connect. They often also share action alerts that are really easy to just, plug and play your information, and it'll send an email or provide information for how to call your congressperson. And excitingly, Blessed Tomorrow and ecoAmerica, we have our Momentous campaign, which is a cross-sector campaign that we're running right now. We launched last fall to encourage ourselves as individuals, our institutional partners in the faith sector, like Creation Justice Ministries, but all of your denominations in the health sector, like the American Public Health Association and others, to have carbon emissions each decade going forward. So it's this sort of bold and ambitious statement. And as part of that, we're running a campaign in August to encourage you all to write letters to the editor and to contact your congressional delegation. And there's a very easy to use, I promise it's very easy to use script that you can use to call your congressional members, how to find their information and get their phone number to call. And then also a sample LTE. Most newspapers, you can just open up a window on your browser, you can plug in, cut and paste that LTE draft, modify it, share your own personal local experiences as Avery was sharing. And chances are they're gonna publish it. And so we encourage you to just go to ecoAmerica.org/momentous, and the information is there. All right, so a couple of other questions here for you, Avery. Can you talk a little more about what you're hearing from congregations that you're working with on this, and what kind of challenges they're facing when they're trying to do this work, or success, and hopefully success stories that you're hearing from on the ground?
Yeah. So just to start with challenges, there's a ton of congregations that are doing everything they can to build resilience in their communities, and yet they need investment. Like, to be honest, our communities need investment from federal and state government and agencies to build resilient systems and infrastructure. And so, that gets back to the advocacy piece that we were just talking about, that our churches can be hubs of resilience, especially spiritual resilience, but it can't stop there, that there needs to be more. So one example is a church here on the coast of North Carolina, St. Paul AME Zion Church. It's been flooded 3 times in the last 15 years. It sits right on the Pamlico Sound. And they desperately need to either move locations or to put their church on stilts, which is becoming a really common practice. And yet they haven't been able to receive grant funding for that, even though they are a frontline community. They are an African-American congregation. And what's happened is the community is, there's a lot of people who are leaving the community, and it's become really hard. And this church has worked really hard to be kind of a center of social resilience and community life. But there's investment that is needed. To share more of a success story, and not to, St. Paul is a success story in the sense that they're doing all they can, and they're doing really amazing work with the community. But one example of another kind of success story is a congregation called Crosstown Church in Charleston, South Carolina. So Crosstown is another congregation that was flooded actually 3 years in a row. In 2015, 2016, and 2017, there were 3 kind of, concurrent hurricanes, starting with Hurricane Joaquin, and then almost a year later to the day, Hurricane Matthew. So flooded 3 times in a row. And so, they had a serious kind of come to Jesus moment of like, what's going on here? And ended up commissioning a hydrologic study to assess their neighborhood and ask, okay, what is going on here? How can we build resilient structures? How can we prevent the kind of unsustainable development upstream, so that as hurricanes and rainstorms continue to increase in intensity, our neighbors in our church is not getting flooded? So they did that. The pastor ended up on like the permitting board for the city around permitting for development, upstream. And during all of this, they were doing a sermon series in their congregation on Nehemiah, talking about all of us standing shoulder to shoulder, rebuilding these systems that are falling apart from the rubble. And that's so compelling to me that yes, climate change is destroying a lot of the things that we love, and it's flooding the places that we love, and it's burning the places we care about. And yet we can show up as a community and stand shoulder to shoulder with each other and continue to build the beloved community, even if we're building it from the rubble of what was there before.
Yeah. Oh, what a powerful example of what I know you've been talking about, which is this, it's resilience isn't just us as individuals or even us as a congregation, but it's us as a community. And that can extend, of course, to the entire human community and the entire creation community worldwide. And so, spending some time thinking about the role, your role and the congregation's role at each of those levels, and leaning in as much as and when we can.
Yeah.
And noting, was it St. John's,
St. Paul.
St. Paul,
Yeah.
St. Paul's example that, did you hear anything? Is it, with this investment thing, is there anyone here on the call today, or that we can be lifting up to funders, to denominations, to organizations like ours, to think about, ways we might be able to provide some support and help. So,
yeah. And one thing I love about the Crosstown story is, their particular asset that they had, which most congregations do not have, but they had, is they had money. They were able to commission this study. But resilience is about looking around and seeing what you do have. Do you have land that you can convert to native habitat for, as you said earlier, our non-human neighbors who are being impacted by climate change? Climate hospitality in the sense of inviting creatures to be a part of that. Do you have space in your sanctuary to welcome people? So it's all about what you and your congregation brings to the table, and that's going to be so different for every congregation.
Do you want to talk at all about the mapping tool that you all have on the website, if people are curious to know, what is happening in my community?
Yeah, certainly. And I can actually share my screen again and just give an introduction to that. So this mapping tool is available at creationjustice.org/resilience, which I'm sure has already been linked in the chat, probably multiple times. But about halfway down the page here, we have a map called Mapping the Climate Church Crisis. And I'll get this up on the screen here. So what we were able to do here is all of the orange dots are congregations across the United States. It's not every single congregation, because it's honestly really hard to find the data. But there are 75,000 congregations who are represented on here, which is a pretty good representative sample of the distribution of congregations. Laid on top of those dots is some data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from the EPA, and from some other agencies. And what we can see here, if we zoom in, is, so we'll go to North Carolina because I'm most familiar with this here. So we can see how different levels of flooding will impact coastal congregations. So this is just current sea level rise right here. Everything in blue is just the current kind of high tide, where the water goes at high tide. So we can look here and see what will happen at 3 feet of sea level rise.
Wow.
You can see even at 3 feet of sea level rise, there is obviously significant changes to the coastline. 6 feet of sea level rise, there's even more eating in here. And what we know is that on our current trajectory, if we don't have kind of the systemic changes that we need, we could have as much as 8 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century.
Wow.
So, what does that mean for a congregation here like Galilee Mission, or, down here on the Outer Banks, St. Francis by the Sea? A map like this kind of presents the reality of the challenges that these congregations are going to be facing. And it also presents the opportunity for a congregation like Zion Episcopal Church right here in Washington, North Carolina. You can see, maybe I'll see if I can zoom in here a little bit. Zion Episcopal is right here near lots of flooding impacts, pretty close here to the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula. And yet, at least according to this model, is on high enough ground that it will not be impacted. So how can Zion Episcopal Church prepare for the impacts that its community is going to be seeing? How can it both do education in its community about how the land is going to change over the next few decades? And how can it start to build physical, social, and spiritual resilience so that the people who are going to be affected are prepared? So you're welcome to visit this tool. You can type in your own church or even your own home address here and see how it will be impacted. You can also look at wildfires on here. So one of the data layers here are active wildfires. So I actually haven't looked at this in a couple of days. I imagine it's pretty bad.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
It's kind of hard to see.
Mm.
It's just like looking at this. But what this shows is, of course, how can churches, again, in the face, these churches close to Fremont National Forest where there's a huge wildfire, house people who are displaced.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I want to share is that the map is a really powerful tool, but it doesn't solve any of our problems. I think what it does is shows us, honestly, it shows us what we already know, but it shows us in a way that kind of is clear and is and tells the truth. And I think all of us can have a tendency to deny the reality of how deeply we might be impacted by climate change. And when we look at this map, we look at the reality of what could happen in the next, the next several decades. But we can't stop there. If we stop there, we're stopping in grief, we're stopping in despair and hopelessness. What this needs to do is propel us into planning for resilience, into building, again, those physical and those spiritual structures so that we can be the beloved community in the face of all of these disasters that continue to unfold around us.
Absolutely. And I think you were saying earlier, I think in response to Reverend Gretchen's question, about getting folks involved in advocacy who may not be already or who may not be comfortable or may have questions. But even at that initial asset mapping type exercise that an individual house of worship might undertake, being able to share that kind of data and to show the community impact. And again, what is community? Maybe it is the individual congregation, but it can also be the immediate surrounding community, or maybe it's a broader community like our state, the impact to our state, or as you mentioned, and I think is such a powerful way to make it real for people, is the concept of migration. And I love the framing that you were using, hospitality, service, and sanctuary. And as people of faith, many faith traditions were called into that. And this is going to be, it is already and will continue to be an opportunity for us to live out our faith values when it comes to those concepts in this context. And we need to start thinking about that now. And I'm just so grateful for the resources that you are working on and putting together and sharing with us today. So thank you. We are coming up about to our time, but I did want to just share, we've had another question come in from Gary and another question come in from Alex about the denominations you're working with. So we did share the creationjustice.org website, a listing of all of your partners are there.
I wish I could say that I have them all memorized, but there's 38. So thanks for sharing that.
We won't fault you, of course. And then Alex was just asking, would it be okay if we share the prayer that you offered? Could we include that in our blog? And
absolutely, yes.
Great. Please. So we'll share that. And obviously ways to make it a multi-faith prayer, but it was beautiful. So thank you so much. Oh, and thanks, Sue. Sue's sharing that this has been an inspiring webinar. So I'm so glad, Sue. And again, we are recording, so it'll be available for all of you. Avery, before we leave, is there anything else you wanted to leave us with before we start to wrap up?
Just leave you with that you all might have the hope and the courage to be disciples of resilience, to go out in the face of despair and grief and disaster and to love and to plan and to be the face of God for communities who are being impacted by climate change.
Well, I'll say amen to that. And again, great appreciation for Avery for joining us today. We
Thanks for having
appreciate
me.
it, of course. So I just want to remind everyone, you can check out Avery's work and his co-executive director, Karen Bigelow, and their wonderful team at the creationjustice.org website. Please check out the Blessed Tomorrow Moving Forward Guide as well. Again, more information on becoming a source of refuge in the face of climate change there. And right now, again, ecoAmerica is running our August recess outreach effort through our Momentous campaign, again, where you can submit letters to the editor, you can call your congressional delegation to advocate for those ambitious and just climate solutions we've been talking about. And so you can visit ecoamerica.org/momentous to learn more about how you might take action today. And I promise it's really easy. It's intimidating, but it's easy. And we've made it as easy as possible. All right. So again, for our listeners, make sure you click the link to the survey when this webcast ends to provide your feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can check out the descriptions below to let us know what you think. Engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership resources and episodes on climate action and advocacy. I'd also encourage you to check out our previous Let's Talk Climate episodes. We've actually had some previous episodes on this or similar topics that you might check out. There's also a wealth of additional conversation on this topic from sessions at the 2021 American Climate Leadership Summit. Again, all of that available on demand on ecoAmerica's YouTube channel. All right, so from all of us at ecoAmerica and Blessed Tomorrow, I want to say thank you, and just your passion is important. Your commitment is needed, and we are with and support you. We will see you next week, and God bless.